I'm Chris Terranova, and this is the Generational Exchange. 4 generations, 1 conversation. Welcome to the Generational Exchange. Ever wondered what happens when you bring together 4 seasoned professionals, each with their unique generational lens on the business world? Well, you've come to the right place. Join our hosts in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s as we tackle the big questions, share decades of combined experience, and unravel the threads of today's professional challenges. Plus, in select episodes, we'll be joined by insightful guest panelists to offer even deeper dives into specific topics. Expect clever takes, engaging debates, a healthy dose of humor, and a few stories proving wisdom is ageless. So let's jump in. All right, guys. How's that for our new intro, right? It's the start of season 2. It's so exciting. We have the band back together. We're all here. And we have a special guest that we'll introduce in just a minute. But let me reintroduce the panel for those of you who are just joining us or haven't joined us for a while. Representing their insightful 30s. That's a new thing for you, Rhett. It's Rhett Suchu. Welcome back, Rhett.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. You're going to love this one, Jeremy. Bringing the perspective of the always dynamic 40s. We have the lovely and talented Jeremy Davidson.
I like that. That way we don't have to guess whether it's the insightful part of the 30s part that's new, right?
Right.
No, appreciate it. Good to be here and really excited about the season 2. So excited to be kicking this off.
It is exciting. And I'm Chris Terranova, representing the experienced 50s. That's a way of saying I'm old. And of course, even older, bringing the wisdom of the 60s as our good friend and a mentor to all of us, Mr. Mark Russell. Hi, Mark.
Thank you, Chris.
Absolutely.
Thrilled to be back.
That's right. We are thrilled to be back. And as I said, we have a special guest, Jess Jensen, who's founder of Copilot Communication. On today's episode, with Jess's help, we are going to tackle the timely topic of fostering meaningful communications in a digital-first world. What is it, how to get it, and why it's important. So with that, let's start the exchange. All right, so before we dive in, let me provide a little bit of background on our new friend, Jess. Jess Jensen is a communication strategist, digital marketer, and entrepreneur. She advocates servant leadership and believes in fostering meaningful communications in a digital-first world. For over 20 years, Jess has shaped how leaders communicate, helping them inspire, clarify, and elevate their voices. Today, she leads Copilot Communications, a company she founded in 2024 to help executives and founders leverage digital channels to bring optimism, inspiration, and gratitude into conversations. Previously, Jess held leadership roles at Microsoft, Adidas, and Nestle, where she honed her expertise in global marketing, executive communications, and narrative strategy. During her decade at Qualcomm, she led the company's worldwide digital communications practice, gaining deep insights into corporate strategy and storytelling. Jess holds a bachelor's degree in psychology, an MBA, and serves on the board of the nonprofit M Perfectly. She lives in Portland, Oregon with her husband and 2 daughters. Outside of work, Jess enjoys supporting local restaurants, cycling and hiking through the scenic Pacific Northwest, and exploring the region's many delicious Pinot Noirs. And who doesn't enjoy a good Pinot? Jess, welcome to the Generational Exchange.
Oh, it's so good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. We're going to be diving in here to our meaty topic of digital-first communications and all of that fun stuff. But before we do that, can you maybe tell us a little bit more about your professional journey?
Yeah, I mean, Christian did a great job just there. I spent about 20 years in corporate roles across brand marketing and digital communications. I was fortunate to kind of be the right age at the right time in my career where I was able to do a lot of experimentation with the early days of social media when it was really just becoming a tool for companies to leverage. And as digital paid media also came to the forefront, I was sort of in those early days, just kind of the right time at the right place. I also had managers that were, in many cases, very supportive of experimentation and iteration, which allowed me to play and learn. And then toward the latter part of my corporate career, as you so eloquently explained, I got to bring a lot of that practice and that experience to our C-suite at Qualcomm and work directly with them in kind of a one-on-one advisory manner, which I really found enjoyable and sort of satisfying in a different way than some of the bigger kind of brand campaign work I had done in the past. And that's really what I pulled forward when I decided to launch Copilot.
So speaking of that, why did you decide to launch Copilot? You worked at some huge companies, you did global marketing. What would make you kind of venture out on your own after a kind of a very successful career like that?
Yeah, thank you. I definitely am a believer in there being seasons or chapters in our
Yeah.
lives at large. Mine tend to be between like 7 and 10 years if I look back,
Okay.
which is just an interesting observation. We'll see if that continues in the back half of my life. But I think that really applies to your career as well. I think
Yeah.
and personally, I think it's really healthy to change things up into the next chapter and maybe even a little before you're sure that you know exactly what you're doing,
Yeah.
to kind of put yourself out there and be a student again. And I think that's over the last year that I've been building Copilot, that's really been my experience. I have had to build muscles and teach myself new things that in ways I haven't had to do for so many years.
I bet.
It's just really good for you. I think it's really healthy.
Yeah, I agree. I think change is always important, right? I think it helps you keep learning. I took a 6 month sabbatical, which I'd never done in my career, and kind of peeling away after being at large companies and small companies, peeling some of that away and kind of getting back to the core of what I wanted to do, like in the back half of my career, probably a quarter now at my age. It's probably not a half, but kind of figuring that out, I think really helps you with that. I'm curious why the name Copilot. It's a great name, but I'm curious why you chose that.
Well, thank you. Well, I fully have to acknowledge that, of course, Microsoft has cornered the term Copilot before I launched the consultancy.
That's
I really love the notion, quite literally, of being someone's co-pilot. I'm happy from time to time to be out in front, but I don't really need to be. I actually really enjoy being an advisor and a partner, someone who has influence, hopefully, and can guide, but also is really helping somebody else shine. And that idea of being a co-pilot, I thought really was emblematic of that position that I hoped to play.
Do you mind
Gotcha.
if I jump in there? I believe it or not, I hadn't made the connection. I've been using Grok. We were talking about this on our last episode, but with that tie-in, do you find, are you guys leveraging AI or some of the emerging technology there in your business model?
Yeah, I think like so many of us, I'm definitely leveraging AI for lots of areas of the business. There's so much more to learn and to grow in that area because it's also changing so rapidly.
Sure.
But I was kind of blown away when I started Copilot with first two things. First, the tools and platforms that exist today to support entrepreneurs and founders. I can only imagine even 10 years ago how much more difficult it would have been to build a website, design a logo, stand up a CRM system. And so many of those tools exist today for founders in ways that I can actually leverage myself without massive infrastructure behind me. So I love that. It's a great time to be a founder. But two, AI, again, fortuitously, AI, of course, we all know, is blown up really since kind of the back half of 23. And I think it is right for people like me and founders to tap into those tools and really augment what we can do and maybe augment even having to hire staff immediately. So I feel really fortunate to be doing this right now.
Sure. No, that's great. Yeah, I wondered if there was even a loose correlation there to the AI emerging trends, but I guess, while it may be a force multiplier, bringing somebody like you in to talk about, some of the strategic communications and the, individual and corporate brand building, that personalized approach to things. I mean, AI can make us maybe 50 times more productive, right? But I haven't seen it replace that personal element yet.
Agreed.
Yeah, I like the way you say it too, that it augments. It isn't a replacement, it's an augmentation. That's great. On your website, you mentioned that you have a commitment to servant leadership, and I absolutely love that. That really resonated with me, and I'm sure it resonated with the rest of the team. But can you talk more about that and why that was important, why that's kind of one of your cornerstones and what it means to you?
Yeah, thank you for asking. It's a term that I only learned myself maybe 5 years ago. And it was someone that I worked with who really exemplified servant leadership. And then I started to kind of research and dig a bit and learn myself what that looked like. And I talk about three components of it. There are many, but on the website for Copilot, I talk about the idea of empathy, stewardship, and growth. And in my experience, those are key components to effective, strong leadership, but they're not necessarily common.
Yes.
So I can speak just to each briefly. I mean, I think we're all familiar with those terms, but empathy, I think, is incredibly important as a leader, both as a human, but also strategically as a business owner or a business leader, right? If you're empathic, you're more likely to understand your target audience, and you're more likely to come up with campaigns and communication that is relevant to them. And that's good for the business, right? But certainly it's also good for your talent, for your employee base, for your partnerships to actually try to walk in others' shoes and care sort of what their challenges might be and how you can be of service to that. I think stewardship is one that I also really love because to me that speaks so much to this. We were talking earlier about chapters, right, in your life, and the notion that, whether it's being in a leadership position at a business, perhaps even starting a company and eventually selling it, or I even think about it from the standpoint of, when we buy homes, most of us don't live in the same home our entire lives.
Right.
So the notion that you're a steward for a chapter of that business or that in that home's sort of trajectory, and then you pass it on to the next, and you want to leave it in as good a shape as possible so that next generation can be successful. I think that's just such a humble, kind of holistic way to lead.
I love that.
Jess, I'm curious as to, do you see different generations embracing those three differently? So, for example, I myself would probably say I'm probably strongest in stewardship. And as my Gallup Clifton strengths will say, I am very weak when it comes to empathy. Do you see these things across the
That's
board?
not true.
Chris disagrees, Mark.
Work with Mark for almost 20 years. I know he's empathetic. He just doesn't like it.
It's a great question. I'll be honest. This might be a good debate for us to have on this podcast. I am reluctant to make any sweeping generalizations about entire groups of people. I'm not, any type. There are, I think, patterns that we observe, right, with different generational differences, but I think a lot of it has to do with how you see your role playing out. If whether you're in your 20s or you're in your 60s, if you are perhaps one that's looking for that spotlight and maybe wanting the stage and sort of the credit, I think it's maybe harder to be a steward in the manner that we spoke, or as empathic as one could be. I think you're a little bit more inner focused, a little more self-focused, perhaps. Now, can that change over the course of our lives? Of course it can. And maybe many of us start off that way when we're younger, and then maybe over time, we sort of have the experience and the expertise and the confidence to kind of settle a little bit and kind of let others go in front of us.
Mhm.
But I'm reluctant to say, this generation has these characteristics and this generation doesn't. I think that a lot of us change over time.
Yeah.
Excellent point.
Jess, speaking to your point of empathy, I think it's critical for both small and larger companies, because in smaller companies, your empathy tends to be very direct, right? You're talking directly to your employees. You have to be empathetic, and that's kind of your team. You have a team of 5 or 6. You can see that direct result, maybe how they are impacted by your statements, your decisions, things like that. But I think, especially we'll probably get into it here with the C-suite conversation, where it's even more important to notice that effect around you, but then how does that cascade down the business? And is everyone kind of following suit with being empathetic and following your message in the right way? Because in very large companies, like a branch of 600 employees, it can be really hard to zone in on that first level of employees, entry level, if you don't have the right metrics, measurements, kind of pain point things in place. So I'm interested to hear your conversations and thoughts on.
Yeah. And I think empathy, a lot of times for me, at least, empathy comes from being a listener.
Mm.
And that's, for a lot of us, that's not always the easiest role to play. A lot of us, we've been socialized to be extroverted and to be verbal and, to be sort of sharing, especially, in this era, right? And digital and in real life ways. And so, again, going back to that servant leadership idea, I do feel like people that tend to lean into servant leadership also tend to lean into being active listeners. And I think you can't help but start to build that empathy muscle when you've spent time hearing people's stories and maybe things that they've been through that you haven't been through. And you wouldn't have thought of it that way until you heard from them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great.
Well, it's interesting you say that too, especially in a social media world where you're kind of programmed, especially some of the younger generations, that you share everything, kind of trying to tie it into what you're doing a little bit. How do you do that without it getting lost in the noise of oversharing and, kind of helping companies do that without it feeling like they're either trying to compete or overshare? I'm not saying that very well, but I think you get where I'm trying to go with it. It's almost a dichotomy of two different things, right? Is social media is necessary to get your message out, but how do you do it in a thoughtful, empathetic servant leadership way?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first you have to spend the time, and this is often that upfront strategy piece of what I do with my clients, to really ask some hard questions. Maybe unless you're someone who is extremely self-aware and have spent already the time and the due diligence to do these things. It's part of what I love bringing out in my clients is sort of these values-based conversations, because at the end, your core values, that's going to be how you show up as a business leader, hopefully, but it's also going to be how you show up with your friendships and perhaps, with a partner, your children, whatever your scenarios might be with, aging parents. And so I think identifying what your core values are, and then which of those values are the ones that you really want to project publicly, starting there is, I find, a key to building things like editorial strategy, for example. And a lot of us, it's so natural, right? A lot of us tend to run to the tactics, right? Run to let's produce the stuff. But until you really know yourself, and then you've also kind of landed, how do I want to publicly be known? What is the legacy that I want to leave when I move on to that next chapter? There's that famous saying, was it Bezos? Someone big said, your brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room. It's the same with your professional brand, right? What is it that people would say about you when you're not there? And first try to decide what those words are, and are they actually germane and authentic to you? Then go into, all right, what are all the things I'm going to make to exhibit those values?
I think about that, and I don't mean to hog the conversation, but just thinking about that as the COO of a company that's growing, we literally have almost no social media footprint. We need to do something about that, but how do you hone in on your mission and your purpose, making it so that it has, like, what do you consider when you're trying to optimize that to make sure that you're including your voice and the company's voice so that you're optimizing? How do you help with that? Because that would be something I would probably have to struggle through, because it's not a well-used muscle in our organization.
Mm. And this nicely goes back to your question about the word co-pilot. I really see myself in that role, especially in this upfront kind of strategy section of the work that we do. We certainly, I'd start with asking a lot of questions, being curious about whomever it is, the leader that I'm working with. How do they see themselves? How do they maybe want others to see themselves? I also do interviews. I'll meet with, folks that perhaps report to this person. Maybe they're a peer, maybe it's an old boss. And I'll ask the same set of questions of, 3 or 4 different people, one-on-one, of course. And that often reveals some really interesting red threads.
Oh, wow.
And then I'll reflect, anonymously, I'll kind of reflect those red threads back to my client and say, here's how they see you show up as a communicator and as a leader. How does that land? Right?
Yeah.
Do you find a lot of shock factor in that, Jess? Is there a lot of difference?
I usually there's a couple differences, but usually I'd say a third of it might be like, oh, I didn't know that, or that's interesting to hear.
Mhm.
2/3 of it is usually pretty aligned with how that person is wanting to show up or how they intend to show up.
Got it. Because Chris always has this thing where he says he's a pussycat, and I'm like, oh yeah, like a mountain.
I'm very that is something we've talked about in one of our previous episodes, though, is that sometimes your title can be intimidating and things like that. And I always thought I was like, I'm super easy to get along with. And Brett's like, you were terrifying. Are you kidding me? And I'm like, you're me? Like, what? So I think getting that red thread, as you're calling it, right back, and getting you to kind of reflect and kind of hold that mirror up and say, let's be authentic. And I think that also helps with authenticity as well in your message. No.
Yeah, I mean, and the word is I was just meeting with someone for coffee yesterday, and we were laughing about this. A former colleague from Adidas, the word authenticity, I know, got so overused like 5-10 years ago. I feel like I was I was like, no, we need a new synonym for this. 'Cause it starts to almost lose its meaning, when it gets overused. Any word. But that said, it is still a really, really good word, and
Mm.
the truth is in my experience working with leaders, especially that again are pretty elevated in their experience level and their career, you would think that the confidence would just rise and rise and rise. And obviously in certain scenarios it does. But what happens also is they know how much is at stake,
Mm.
right? Publicly
Yeah.
communicating on a podcast like this, or in a traditional press interview, on a keynote or fireside chat live with an audience, certainly on digital channels like social or email or blogging, that they're very aware that what they say can sway markets, can carry weight with the employee base. And in many ways, it'll cause them to sort of pull back and kind of be more conservative. And I respect that very much. It took me a while. That was one of those learnings that I had to come to when I was younger, because I didn't understand the pressure that they carried. But as I saw that happen again and again, I started to understand. And I feel like my superpower is being able to help them balance. Let's do the right thing by the company. Let's do the right thing from the standpoint of not, cause no harm. But how can we also kind of open the kimono a little bit in terms of revealing some of your personality and some of your values and priorities through these communication methods? And we can do both.
Mm.
I guess along those lines, what would be something that's being said in the C-suite that people should know right now?
Well, I mean, at this moment in time, I know there's a lot of uncertainty. That's like our new favorite word, right? And uncertainty in the market, the economy, certainly at an international level. And I understand that is a real pressure when you're leading a company. And then, I've worked for a lot of publicly traded companies. I know there's just in general a lot of financial pressure, right? You're a master to the street, or servant to the street, I should say. Your quarterly earnings, it's often sort of, what have you done for me lately, right? You're only as good as the last 3 months. So you're constantly needing to show results and progress and, movement. Again, I think there's a lot of pressure that many of those leaders carry that they can't necessarily reveal to their teams or even their directs in many cases. But I do think that a lot of them, I mean, especially the ones that would reach out to someone like me to work with them, they want to be seen as whole humans.
Mm.
And they're just maybe not quite sure how to articulate that in public forums.
It's
Why is Go ahead, Brett.
I
I'm
was
sorry,
gonna
go
say, Jess, it's kind of like the age-old problem of how to be vulnerable without being vulnerable to attacks on not being confident or in control of the situation, or coming off as fake, or like you don't experience any of that pressure, right? Sometimes never being phased has your employees more stressed out because you don't seem stressed out, and then you're not matching their energy. And how is this guy never freaking out? The market's just plummeted. He's not freaking out. Da, da, da. Where you may be internally doing that, but you have to find that balance between feeling with them and understanding and explaining the pressure of it, but also you're the leader of that team and you're the one driving the ship. So how do you keep everyone and motivate everyone while also being empathetic of their feelings? Yeah, I mean, I guess, and to your second point there, when you find an individual who maybe, because we've talked about on this channel, our kind of group to talk to each other about the hard conversations such as this, right? When we get off of work, we talk to each other, we bounce ideas off of each other. That, am I being authentic? That, am I hiding too much of this? Hey, I had a tough situation today. This is how I handled it. How would you have handled it? When you find an individual who doesn't necessarily have that, do you encourage that? Is that a question you ask? I'm curious.
Well, I think you bring up a great point about vulnerability. I know, Brene Brown, again, has now become so deeply associated with that term, and there's a lot more conversation, I think, in the zeitgeist, which is great. It's kind of coming to the surface.
Yeah.
When maybe 10 years ago, vulnerability was still perhaps misunderstood.
Sure.
I think that it's a magic. I think if you can, this goes back to the notion of being empathic, right? If you can share a vulnerability, align or show empathy toward how others might also be feeling that kind of vulnerability. Again, think about it in a business setting. If things are on downhill, if they're financially maybe not where you want them to be, it does us no good to not acknowledge it, right? We need to acknowledge it. Say it out loud, say how it makes you feel, maybe acknowledge that others might be feeling scared as well. But it's that notion of align, pause, and then build. Right? But I think we skip the first. Often we're trained to just go right into like the solution.
Right.
And in my experience, and this is kind of getting beyond communications externally, maybe it's more internal communications here, but it's all very related. And so if you can share that vulnerability or share that fear, align with those around you, your employee base, your directs, your board of directors, whoever it is, pause and then go, okay, but here's my plan.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a critical point that you're touching on there, where it's almost like, when those tough times hit, things happen both in the business world and usually in our personal lives if things are getting tough in our business life. And if you ignore that conversation, that one-on-one, which we've talked about, having a regular one-on-one with people, asking them how they're doing, it's almost like, instead of, let's say you get a major cut, instead of sewing up the wound, you just put a Band-Aid on and saying, everything's going to be fine, we're going to be great. And then you get a bunch of scar tissue and you never fully heal. And maybe it leaves a bad taste in your mouth for how the company handled it, right? Like, they didn't even acknowledge that sales had a horrible Q1, but like customer success was really impacted by it. And we didn't talk about it. I think that's a really good point you made, where it's pause, don't jump straight to the solution. Think about, whatever that impact is, talk about it, acknowledge it, and then come up with your solution. Right.
So it's a mature leader that you're dealing with, like your product market fit, so to speak. It would jump out at me as kind of being a mature executive, somebody that empathetic, they're self-aware, they've got high, EQ, maybe they've specifically chosen their career path based on, a higher purpose fit, right? A mission driven organization or a mission driven company, something that they're passionate about and behind. Do you work with folks that are earlier in their career that maybe haven't obtained that level? Like I could totally see somebody in that earlier description that really wants to get into that legacy building and, how do I craft my brand for the next generation? Is there a way to jump in, or do you guys jump in with the next generation of managers, directors, leaders within an organization and try to coach to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I've seen is that the kinds of people that reach out to me to partner with Copilot, they tend to be either at or nearing a pivot. There's some kind of juncture that they're anticipating. So for example, it could look like I'm in my current role. I'm okay. I'm good. But I see myself in a year being maybe in a different company. Or maybe I thought I was going to get elevated into this other leadership position and I didn't. And I think I maybe have I need to do some work. There's something that I'm not showing up maybe exactly as I mean to show up.
Mm.
Or it could be I've built this company. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a founder. I built this company to a certain level, and I'm ready to transition out. And I want to have a successor in play, and I'm ready to kind of get that person in. And I'm going to build something new next. But I need to be more than just my company. I'm so deeply associated with my company, and I want to be associated with something bigger than that in this next chapter. So I find that it tends to be people that are, I guess, maybe my age and older, but that's not a hard line, who are in those kind of big junctures and they're really trying to be thoughtful. I think that when folks are maybe earlier in their career, they're certainly making changes and they have different chapters and pivots, but I think it's still kind of a minority, if I'm really honest with you, that are really thinking long term about legacy and professional brand, unless they are intending to be a creator or an influencer and they really know that this is going to be
Sure.
life's work. I think it takes a lot of foresight to be able to look ahead and start to build that before you really need it.
Well, that's what I was thinking. If I knew then what I knew now, where's the forces out there telling the up and comers, right? Hey, these are going to be really important things for you to kind of master.
Well, I think of Chris bringing in Mark for the leadership coaching to kind of that new group of managers who we were all very, high performers, but going into a new role and now people managing and all that, getting ahead of the curve in so many aspects really helped us avoid a lot of pitfalls, which I think would be interesting to see, Jess, as well from that standpoint of like how does it go differently when you get there before they reach that juncture type of thing, right? That'd be interesting.
Yeah. Well, and unfortunately, I think we're all human and whatever person, call it the 80-20 rule, right? Maybe 20% of the human race is looking way ahead, proactively formulating a plan, developing a roadmap, all that stuff. A lot of people are just not.
Yeah.
For all kinds of good reasons, right? Me included, certainly in certain scenarios where you're kind of more reacting or you're more responding to what's in front of you. But I've seen this happen with brands, not just individuals, where if there's a vacuum, if you haven't defined yourself as if you're an individual, as more than just being, I work at X company. That's it. That's my whole professional brand. I work in X company, which is the case for a lot of folks, really. And for, again, lots of good reasons. But as a brand, if you've sort of allowed there to be a vacuum where you haven't really built an emotional connection and a deep association with certain things and your company, if something goes left and then there is a negative wave of press, you have no foundation. You have nothing to stand on.
Right.
And so it kind of gives this opening that you didn't mean for the sort of the greater public to just define who you are, and you don't get a say in it.
Yeah.
So you can prevent a lot of that. I believe, both as a company, I'm kind of straddling now my brand marketing background from historical work and my like more individual work that I do with leaders. But in either case, you're preventing a lot of that potential vacuum and others defining you if you get out in front and you go ahead and create what that brand looks like proactively.
That's great.
Just as we kind of wrap down here, I think there's one important question around what are the emerging trends you're seeing, as well as how are people reframing kind of that pendulum where we're, kind of moving away from the acronym DE&I, but yet at the same time, I need a diversity of thought of multiple generations in my workplace to really kind of keep that pulse. What are you seeing, and where do you see it maybe 9 to 12 months from now?
Yeah, I mean, on the emerging trends piece, we talked about it a little bit before the top of the call. We can't be in any conversation on any day of the week and not talk about AI. But why I bring that up here where it's relevant is I actually think not only to me is AI a win just from an efficiency and sort of time saving standpoint, but I actually think in my line of work, it's also a win because I believe what is happening and what will continue to happen in the coming years is that because AI is going to make content creation for digital channels so incredibly easy and accessible for all of us, there will be a wave of mediocrity.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yes.
Of sameness, homogeneity, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
And so the way that you cut through that is by being authentic, is by being imperfect, right? Is by being who you actually are. And that is how you're going to differentiate yourself as a leader from the sea of AI generated content that is not really rooted necessarily in humanity in the way that we wish it might be.
And is that why this is important? Like, as we talk through all this, if we talk about the red thread of all that we've talked about, why is having a social media presence, having a brand, having a communication strategy using Copilot, why is that important? You know, why would that be necessary as the world's evolving, to your point?
Yeah, I mean, partly it's that idea of, again, you be the architect. You design what you want others to say about you when you're not in the room, whether it's your company or you as an individual. Proactively land that plane and nurture it, right? It's not just a one and done. Nurture it over time so that either if it's a business, others will be attracted to you and want to buy from you. If it's an individual, it might be that you're looking to attract recruiters or future talent or investors, right? We know, people buy from people that they like, and people also buy from brands that they are emotionally connected to. And that's just, we've known that for years, right? That's nothing new. Coca-Cola did that 100 years ago. But we're just applying it to people because really we're all kind of now our own walking brands, and it's up to us to define that. And digital is the logical place for most of us to do that in. I think the thing that I've really seen shift in my career, even in the last decade, is the business to consumer, the B2C versus the B2B, business to business sort of realm. I think there has historically been an understanding of this notion of brand is powerful in the B2C space. But I think for a long, long time, B2B leaders and even B2B companies didn't necessarily believe that that was how they were going to move the needle. And I think social has really changed that. B2B it's B2B2C, right? You're eventually talking to people. So, and they're all on digital channels in some form or fashion. So no longer can sort of the B2B world kind of go, nope, that's not for me. Well, it is. Your customers are all there.
Well, to wrap this up, and that you have been very gracious with your time, and you can tell we could talk to you for hours. What are two big takeaways that our listeners should act on or get from our conversation today?
I would say that certainly, I mean, the work that I do, it's definitely not a one size fits all. And that's for the reasons that we talked about before. Idea of asking yourself, and ideally with a partner, what are my core values? What are my priorities? How can I be intentional and reflective about how I show up now publicly based on that? That's going to be a unique flower for every person, right? No two of us will be the same. So the notion that this is, again, we're getting into AI, the notion that we can kind of copy paste stuff and that it's going to actually resonate, I think is generally inaccurate assumption. I think there's a lot of uniqueness in the way that we communicate and the things that we communicate about. And so I think that's really important just to remind ourselves that there is that not one size fits all. I think second, it would be around this idea of not underestimating the power of your voice. You're going to go back to that notion of most people are consuming, right? Leaning back and consuming. And a very few are actually liking, responding, sharing, promoting, right? It's still that way today, even as ubiquitous as digital is. And so I am always amazed at, I'll do this kind of podcast and it'll be on social, and a couple weeks later I'll see someone in real life for coffee, and they'll say, I heard what you said on that podcast, and I really liked what you said about XYZ. And I would never have known. They didn't comment, they didn't do anything in any form that I could see, but it left a bit of a mark. It left a bit of a memory for them. And so I love those moments because it reminds you and all of us not to underestimate how many people really are hearing and seeing what you're putting out in the world. And you may never know the impact that you're having, but you're having an impact.
That's cool. That's great.
Now, how about that for motivation?
Yeah,
Right?
there you go.
That's
Mic
great.
drop.
Yeah.
Mark, you want to take us home on this?
Yeah. So just as people learn more about you and Copilot Communications, where can they go?
Oh, thank you for asking. So my website is copilotcommunications.com. And you can certainly find out more about what we do from a services perspective, a little bit about me. My bio is there, and get in touch. And then if you just want to see more of my kind of day-to-day, my own content creation, my own voice out loud, I do a lot of publishing on LinkedIn, and you can find me at Jessica K. Jensen on LinkedIn.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much for joining us. This was a great discussion. It's got me really thinking about my digital,
I know. I'm thinking,
brand. I got to really think about that now. But thank you so much for joining us. This was great. We are going to take a quick break, and when we return, we're going to kind of get together as a 4-pack here and share our thoughts and maybe share some more stories. So make sure you tune back in.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Jess.
Thank you, Jess.
Thank you, Jess.
All right. Thanks again to Jess Jensen in part 2. We're going to have our very first part 2 episode. We are going to kind of debrief. I'm excited to hear what you guys have to say and got from Jess. I got to talk to her all day. Maybe
She was phenomenal,
She was
right?
amazing. Talk a little bit about our personal brands and communication and, what we're doing in our organization. So listen in for that. We're going to have a part 2. We're going to release that after part 1. So make sure you follow up because you're going to get to hear our feedback even more. And nobody loves to listen to us talk more than us. So make sure you listen in. And with that, that brings us to the end of another episode of the Generational Exchange. We are so grateful you joined our intergenerational conversation, and we hope it sparks some new ways of thinking about business. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more engaging conversations across the generations. If you'd like to be a panelist, if you have a business question that keeps you up at night, we all have those, or if you want to tell us what you thought about the episode, let us know in the comments or email us at feedback@thegenerationalexchange.com. We have a new email address. I'm going to say that again. feedback@thegenerationalexchange.com. But until next time, from all of us here at the Generational Exchange, thanks for listening and happy learning.